Last week from my ill position up here, I mentioned that I was going to begin a series on culture, on encountering the culture and how the church is to encounter the culture. And where I want to start with that today is just by taking a look at our cultural crisis that we're in the midst of, all right? First of all, if you have paid any attention at all, the word culture has risen to the top of kind of essentials, right? Every organization has a culture that they're trying to establish. When Urban Meyer resigned as the head coach of the Ohio State Buckeye football team, his successor, Ryan Day, said, the culture that Coach Meyer has established here is amazing, second to none. Restaurants have cultures. And that culture begins to be established with the very name of the restaurant, with the logo of the restaurant. And when you walk in, you have an expectation based on the culture that's established. Churches have cultures. Northwest has a culture unlike any other church. It's unlike any other church because of the people who attend here and make it up and sort of the DNA that has been infused into this local church through the years. Culture's defined as the behaviors and the belief characteristic of a particular social, ethnic, or age group. All right? That's just kind of a very short, simple definition of culture. It's the behaviors and the beliefs that are characteristic of a particular social, ethnic, or age group. And so when you start thinking about cultures that are around you, we are surrounded by them. And there's cultures and there's subcultures, and it can get very messy. It can get very specific. It changes. You go into a high school and you see multiple cultures at work within that high school. So let's talk for just a moment about our nation's culture. When our nation was founded, there was a prevailing culture that believed in God and godly principles. In fact, that was the dominant culture for quite a few years. I want you to watch this video clip from a television show that aired somewhere between 1957 and 63. It was a very popular television show, right? So take a look at this.
Beaver, you know the real reason you're being punished, don't you?
Because I made you and Dad mad.
No, because you played over at the new house and you told those lies about the dog biting you.
I guess so.
Beaver, it's telling lies that gets us into trouble. You'll always be safe if you tell the truth. And anyway, even when you think you're getting away with it, God knows you're lying.
How?
Oh, because God knows everything. He sees everything.
Right through the roof?
Right through the roof.
Right through the ceiling?
And through the ceiling.
Would God see if I hid in my closet?
Yes, Beaver. You see, God is everywhere.
Was God there when Dad was talking to Mr. Rutherford on the telephone?
Well, Beaver, that was a little bit different, you see. Well, your father was tired, and he didn't want to hurt Mr. Rutherford's feelings, and... Well, Beaver, I'm afraid sometimes your father and I make mistakes.
That's okay. I make it myself sometimes, Mom.
Well, you lie down now and take a nap.
Okay, Mom. Mom?
Yes, Beaver?
You gonna make Dad take a nap, too?
No, but I think there's something else your father's going to do.
Oh my. How many of you remember when Leave It to Beaver aired on television? Well, certainly a few of us remember the reruns. But But was Leave It to Beaver, was it a Christian television show? No, not at all. It was just a television show that reflected the American values of the time. The prevailing culture at that point went to church. It was filled with integrity and was driven to do the right thing. And so when you saw mainstream entertainment in the 1950s, it seemed as if it was intentionally Christian. Jerry Mathers, the actor who played the beaver, in an interview, he told viewers that the very first episode of Leave It to Beaver was banned from TV. It was that controversial, all right? Now, here's what was controversial about it. There was a scene in that episode where a toilet was shown. And that was considered to be immodest. And so that episode of Leave It to Beaver was banned from television until they could come up with some kind of compromise. In 1952, 75% of Americans said that religion was personally very important. 75%. By the mid-1970s, that percentage had fallen to 35%. That's a 40% drop in about 20 years in the number of people who said that their religion was very important to them. And that shift was also reflected in church attendance. In 1958, 50% of the population regularly attended church. 50%. 1 in 2 people went to church regularly. By 1969, only 40% of the population attended church. That's a big drop. It was even more of a dramatic change among people that were in their 20s. In 1957, 51% of 20-somethings attended church. By 1971, that number had fallen from 51% to 28% of 20-somethings that regularly attended church. There was a major shift that was taking place away from godliness and as a result, away from the church for the first time in our nation's history. And most of the population, though, still held on to godly morals and accepted them as normal. But you could see the beginning of the trend moving away. If you compare television shows that were popular in the 60s and 70s to those like what we just saw, you can see a changing culture. One of my favorite shows, Gilligan's Island. Now, Gilligan's Island, I think we've got pictures of these. They aren't the best pictures in the world. But Gilligan's Island was based on the dangers of the 7 deadly sins. Each one of the characters sort of represented one of the deadly sins. But Gilligan's Island used the lure of those 7 deadly sins to draw the audience in. I mean, who wasn't drawn in by Ginger's seductiveness? Or the millionaire's, Thurston Howell's materialism? Another show, I Dream of Jeannie, pushed the lines of modesty when Barbara Eden bared her midriff and low-cut shirt. Long gone were the days when it was immodest to show a toilet on TV. Great show in the 70s came along called Happy Days. And Happy Days did its best to show kind of the family values that had been prevalent in society, because it was a family that would eat together and they struggled together and they worked together. But Happy Days celebrated individualism to draw people in. I mean, who wouldn't want to be Arthur Fonzarelli, right? These shows blurred the lines between right and wrong, between good and bad. between faith in God was really no longer on display in our entertainment, reflecting the fact that faith in God was on the decline in our society. And the emphasis celebrated or shifted to celebrating individualism and personal freedom. Today, it seems as if our culture has long abandoned godliness and godly principles in all of our major institutions. And oftentimes it seems as if the minority is setting a value for the majority, and right and wrong are left up to the individual. I've been in several conversations lately that I think kind of show how our culture has spiraled into this crisis. The first conversation I had with someone, it went something like this: who are you to tell me not to steal from other people? It's the only way that I can live is by stealing. It's the only way I can live. And so it's a celebration of this moral freedom that we have, where it might be wrong for you to steal, but it's right for me to steal because that's the way that I live. And to be able to speak it openly says how far we've spiraled. Another conversation went like this: I'll let my kids decide what's best for them. They know what they like and what they don't like. That doesn't sound too bad. I mean, I want my kids to decide for them, right? What's best? But they're nearly 18, and they still don't get to decide all the way what's right for them. Just ask them. But the kids that I was having this conversation about were 8 and 9. 8 and 9. I'll let them decide what's best for them. They know what they like and what they don't like. We as a people overall in our culture, we've bought into the lie that society's values that tell us that it's all about us. Whatever we want to do, it's up to us. And what we are experiencing in our culture, though, is no different than what's happened hundreds of times in past cultures. There are several biblical examples that I would point you to. The first one comes from 2 Chronicles chapter 6. When we read the story there of Solomon dedicating the temple to God, he's crying out to God to forgive the people when they sin, and to remember his promise to David, and to keep a family member on the throne. And in chapter 7, we see God reply to Solomon. He says this, he says, "As for you, if you walk before me faithfully as David your father did, and you do all that I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne, as I covenanted with David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a successor to rule over Israel. But if you turn away and you forsake the decrees and the commands that I have given you, and you go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will uproot Israel from my land, which I have given them." You hear the spiral in there? If you turn away, if you forsake the decrees and the commands, if you serve other gods and you worship them, then I will uproot Israel from the land. That's the spiral. And I will reject this temple I have consecrated for your name. I'll make it a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. This temple will become a heap of rubble. All who pass by will be appalled and say, why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple? People will answer, because they have forsaken the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who brought them out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why he brought all this disaster on them. We all know that the people of Israel were scattered and the temple was destroyed a couple of times because they did not stay faithful to God and instead chose to worship other gods. A second biblical example where we see this decline into a cultural crisis comes in the story of the people of Israel after they were delivered out of Egypt. The first generation that came out of Egypt, they knew God. They had experienced his mighty hand at work. They knew him up close and personal. They had been there when he fed them manna from above and provided water for them. But then something interesting happens in the next generation, which we read in Judges chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. It says, after Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land. And I think this is the key little phrase in here. Each to their own inheritance. See the emphasis on individualism? All of a sudden, it goes from being the people of Israel to now the people of Israel are each going to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua. It all sounds good, right? And of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. But then when you skip to the third generation, first generation saw the hand of God move. The second generation stayed faithful and served, each in their own inheritance. And now the third generation in Judges chapter 2, 10 and 11, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. So you have this cultural crisis happening where the culture was godly and moved to godless and did evil in the sight of God. In Romans chapter 1, we see the same spiral of sin taking place in the Roman culture. Starting in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that the people are without excuse. In other words, there is this God. We see him. There is no excuse. We know that God is God. But then when we get to verse 21, although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Either women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and they were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men, and they received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Downward spiral of culture. Moving from God-centered to godless. It's happened time and time and time again. In each case, the culture turns away from God, turns away from his values, and the entire nation suffers from the sin of the prevailing culture. And here we are in 2019 in the United States of America, where we have undergone a major culture shift over the past 50 to 60 years. So much so that we can see the effects of America's sin at this point. I mean, let's be honest. We're in a cultural crisis. Turn the news on, and it doesn't take long before you see the crisis we're in. How about the bank robber that was caught this week after he had robbed 4 banks? There are stories this week of increased racial tension. A neighbor stopped by my house yesterday to tell me that they're living in their van after he had open heart surgery 2 months ago. We've got neighbors fighting neighbors, and it doesn't matter what neighborhood you're in. About the story of the young lady who was rescued after she had been kidnapped by a 21-year-old who murdered her parents a couple months ago. Our culture is in a crisis. So what do we do as a church? What do we do as Christian people, as the body of Christ? And there's one word. There's one word. And it's this. We engage. We engage. We engage the culture. I mean, we really only have 2 options. It's engage or not engage. Either way, we're going to be impacted and affected by the culture. Either way, we're going to feel the effects of it. And so we either intentionally engage the culture with the intent of seeing it transformed, or it will creep in and impact us. All 3 biblical examples that I gave you of culture shifting away from godliness, in all 3 of them, there's an attempt to engage the culture. In example 1, 2 Chronicles 7, verses 12 through 16, where God was talking about they need to follow him or he will uproot them as a people. Here's what he says right prior to that, verses 12 through 16. I've heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a temple for sacrifices. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command locusts to devour the land, or send a plague among my people. But then here's the engagement. Here's the engagement. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayers offered in this place. I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. What do? We engage in humility and in prayer. With an attitude of humility and with a posture of prayer, we engage the godless culture. You know, heaven and earth are shaken by our prayers. When we humbly engage the culture in prayer, when we intentionally turn from our own sin, God moves in mighty ways. In the second example, in Judges, the implication is that somebody dropped the ball and failed to tell the greatness of God. I mean, the verse says, after that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. I mean, if a whole generation grew up and did not know God, nor what he had done for Israel, somebody forgot to tell the kids. Somebody forgot to tell the kids how great God is. And when we engage the culture by telling the story of how great God is, he can do mighty things in our culture. I mean, God's got an amazing story. You're part of his story. Are you sharing it in our culture? In the third example, in Romans chapter 1, where that passage of Scripture, every time I read it, I quake because of where it takes us. But Paul begins by saying these words in verse 14. I am obligated both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and the foolish. That is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. because it's the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. How do we engage? We engage by sharing the gospel. With our culture, we engage by sharing the good news of the gospel. And when we engage the culture by seeing all people, no matter how messed up they are, or no matter how together they seem to have things, no matter whether they're rich or poor, black or white, no matter what cultural slant they come from, when we see all people as our obligation, and when we ourselves are not ashamed of the gospel, believing that it's the power of God that brings salvation to everybody who believes, then God can move in mighty ways and transform cultures. Do you believe that God can transform culture? Whew, man, I want to believe it, but if I'm honest, it's tough to believe. We moved in to Franklinton 12 years ago, basically. Part of the reason we moved there was because we felt like, God wanted us there to help see that culture in Franklinton transformed. And, 12 years later, most of the transformation that's taking place is coming from the outside. The heart of the community is not being transformed the way that God necessarily paints that picture. And tough to believe sometimes that he really does transform culture. I mean, it's hard to picture a culture that's free from the grip of alcoholism or drug abuse or greed or pride or sexual sin. Our culture, it's in a crisis. But I've got to be honest with you here. Our culture might be in a crisis, but I think the real cultural crisis belongs to the church. I think the church is caught in a cultural crisis. I think it's a bigger cultural crisis than what the prevailing culture is in, because we don't know how to engage our culture in this post-Christian era. Things have changed out there, but overall in the church, things have kind of stayed the same. I mean, if you think about what's taken place in the 1950s, you could count on people or families just coming to church because that's what they did. In the 1960s, even though they weren't coming to church quite as often, you could still count on people having an understanding of the gospel and of salvation. In the 1980s, some of that understanding was disappearing, but there was still a relative understanding of what was right and what was wrong, what was good and what was bad. But for a long time, the church overall in America just kind of said, well, let them do their thing. We're happy in here. We're happy in here. And then when the church did finally catch up and say, wow, people aren't just coming to church anymore, maybe we ought to do something about it. We tried this whole thing called a seeker-sensitive movement, where we made things easy for people to come into the church. And you know what happened as a result of the seeker-sensitive movement? The church kept shrinking. And here we are in 2019, where people don't just walk into church. And when they do, we're not prepared to engage with a person who has no understanding of what church is all about. In fact, many people from our society today, they don't even know who Jesus is. And the church, in so many ways, has tried to adapt But instead of engaging the culture is engaged us. And unfortunately, the church looks a lot like the prevailing culture instead of reflecting the holiness of God. You see, we have a culture crisis in the church. And we have that crisis because Jesus said these words. He said, "You're the light of the world. You're the salt of the earth." And when he says that, the responsibility to be the light and to be the salt falls on us, the body of Christ. There's no easy answer in this. There's no simple fix. But over the next few weeks, what I hope to do is to lay out a few models of the ways in which we, the church, engage the culture with the good news of Jesus Christ. Now, here's the deal. I'm smart enough to know that sitting out here, there are people that are saying, right now, "You preach it, Pastor Mike. You preach it. Oh, Pastor Mike, don't talk about the church that way. Oh, Pastor Mike, this is dangerous ground. Oh, we need to hear this." You're all kinds of thoughts are going through your mind. Some of you are saying, "What's wrong with the culture out there? There's a lot of good in the culture out there." And I would say to all of you, yep, you're right. You're right. But some of us move so far this direction or so far this direction that all that can exist between us when we have this conversation is a little bit of friction. And over the next few weeks, when I lay out these models, I can tell you that there are two of them that I'm comfortable with and two of them that I'm not. But here's the thing. If we are going to successfully engage our culture as the salt and the light, then we've got to move to the middle and say, what you bring to the table is as valuable as what I bring to the table. Because we're in a cultural crisis. And the church in America is going to continue to do this unless we figure out how to engage our culture with the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ in a way that radically transforms lives. And in a way that radically embraces the lost and those that are different than we are. I'm kind of tired of existing in a church, not Northwest, hear me on that, okay? Not this local body, but in a church overall that's afraid to get dirty hands by engaging where people are with the powerful good news of Christ. That's where we're headed over the next few weeks. We have to keep hope. As the people of God, we have to keep hope. We have to live lives that are committed to holiness. Otherwise, the culture will suck us in. You guys realize, whether you realize it or not, we have the only message that delivers on the hope that's promised. We as Christians have the only message that delivers. And time again through history, God has showed himself to be our only hope. And if our culture is going to change, it's going to be through the power of God as we, the church, actively engage the culture right where they are. I have no idea where this is going to land with you guys. I really don't. But I know personally I need the challenge of these next few weeks. So, do me a favor. Just show up and let's see where it goes, okay? That sounds like an interesting plea. But just show up and let's see where it goes. And maybe, just maybe, we'll find ourselves saying, God, use me however you see fit. Use me however you see fit. Worship team, will you come forward and lead us in our final closing song this morning? And let's all stand together. Father, you have uniquely positioned us where we are. We're a body of believers in Northwest Columbus, Ohio, where we are surrounded by city, suburban living, lots and lots of young families, lots of ethnic diversity, lots of sexual orientation diversity. And you have seen fit to put us, your people, right here in the midst of it. If we're honest, we don't understand all of the cultural slants. We don't understand the hows and the whys, and it brings out all kinds of attitudes in us. But God, we do recognize this. You've placed us here to engage the culture, whatever it is, in a way that is salt and light, in a way that presents your powerful gospel and transforms the culture. God, forgive us for the fact that maybe we as a church in America have not responded the way that we should have. Oh my gosh, so many times we've said things or done things that have probably pushed the culture farther away from you than instead of drawing it to you. But God, today we recognize that you want to use us in all of our diversity to engage the culture in a great way. So God, over these next weeks, will you teach us to be salt? Will you teach us to be light? Will you teach us to point the people that we come in contact with every single day, to point them to you? Because God, we know this, the church is not meant to be empty and powerless. The church is a powerful tool, a powerful living organism in your hands. We can't be the body of Christ without that power. And so, God, we long to see your power move through us and out into the world around us. So you've got permission to teach us a thing or two. You've got permission to use us however you see fit. Thanks, God, for the privilege of being here in Northwest Columbus at Northwest Church of the Nazarene. Amen. Well, we may as well start now, right? Practicing. So go and be the salt. Go and be the light that points people to Christ. You've got a powerful Savior. Introduce people to him. Have a great day.